Hello and welcome back, folks. Today we're working on a very special diorama in collaboration with Terrain by Aaron. We're each creating a project focused on the American Wild West. For my project, I chose to do a diorama centered around one of the West's most iconic vehicles, the stagecoach. I 3D printed the vehicle for this project on my Anycubic Photon Mono X2 printer using standard Anycubic gray resin. This was then primed in black with a gray zenithal highlight coat before we started applying paint. The first thing we're painting is going to be the wood base color on areas of the coach that will be weathered all the way down to the wood layer below the paint surface. This was painted with a Vallejo tan earth color. I'll be listing the paint colors that I'm using in the top left of the screen throughout the video as we go as well for you to reference. The next layer of paint is going to be the same tan earth color with about 50% Vallejo Stonewall Gray added to create a visual wood grain texture as well as to indicate areas where the exposed wood is beginning to age. As we go through these steps, I'd like to share with you some of the history of this emblematic vehicle. While coaches were not a new invention, as humankind had been using horse-drawn modes of transportation for centuries, it provided a more comfortable method of crossing the countryside as they utilized a leather-strap suspension system that created a rocking motion while covering rough roads. Stagecoaches in the United States began to be used commonly in the late 18th century, primarily between cities in the northeastern states. Later in the 18th century, coaches began to be used not just to transport passengers, but also to transport mail. And by the 1860s, coaches were a common sight crossing the country to and from the Wild West. Now we're going to paint the coach's base a little bit more. We're going to paint the wood with a mix of 25% pale brown and 75% bone white. This will create the older wood that has been weathered by years of exposure to dirt and dust. I can imagine that this particular coach has spent years crossing the desert trails of the heat of Arizona. As we paint the lower base boards, you can see the leather suspension system on either side. This system is critically important for the stagecoaches as they produced a very smooth ride, often described as a rocking motion. American novelist Mark Twain was quoted in his 1872 book Roughing It as describing stagecoaches as, quote, an imposing cradle on wheels. This comfort was important as customers would typically pay fares between $5 and $200 a person depending on the distance of the trip. In comparison, however, the cheapest steamboat tickets at the time were approximately only $2. Now we're repeating the same wood base color layering process under the stagecoach's cabin. For this, we're using the same color mix of Vallejo colors as in the previous step. We're focusing the effect on areas where the stagecoach would get wear and tear from passengers and coach staff climbing on and off the coach, as well as adding and removing luggage from the vehicle. This is primarily going to be focused on areas as well that are also exposed to the sun and the desert heat and sands in this specific case. The coach we're creating today operates on a fictitious line between cities and towns in Arizona. The carriage has been exposed to years of sun and sand along the dusty trails before ending up in its current situation. I take this opportunity to ask you to like and subscribe to the video as it really helps out our channel, and I want to extend a special thank you to our Patreon members who make these projects possible, specifically Travis Hilt, Ty Nora, and Lady Garber. The next thing we're going to work on is a top coat for the wheels. These are going to be painted in a Vallejo sun yellow color. This will require multiple coats as yellow is notorious for poor coverage. This was based on several historical reference images I found while researching this project, and it appears that yellow wheels were fairly common on stagecoaches in the Old West. This paint coat was applied over a thin coat of hairspray that was applied off camera to the vehicle. This will assist in weathering and chipping effects later in the build. Please let us know down in the comments what Wild West vehicle you would use, and if you made it this far into the video, make sure you use the code word Tombstone. The next part of the build is going to be applying the stagecoach's primary red color. The paint we used for this is Vallejo Blood Red. This layer was also applied over a thin layer of hairspray that was applied off camera as well. We'll cover the chipping effects that this was used for later in the video in detail. This color was also determined from historical reference images I found during my research for the project. Stagecoaches were often a target for highwaymen and thieves throughout the Wild West, with over 450 confirmed stagecoach robberies, resulting in millions of dollars of gold and cash stolen. Stagecoaches were also frequent targets for attacks by Native American raiding parties as well. I can't help but imagine that the bright, highly visible colors played a small part in that. The stagecoach we're building for this project has unfortunately suffered the same fate deep in the deserts of Arizona. Now we're going to age and weather the paint on the coach's wheels. This is done by taking a stiff bristled brush dampened in water. The water will reactivate the hairspray layer under the yellow paint. This will allow us to remove small layers of the top coat a little at a time. This helps to create a series of small chips in the paint surface. This effect also can be accomplished with dedicated chipping products, but I always want to make sure that you know easier, cheaper options when they're available. The next step is to apply the same technique to the passenger compartment of the coach as well. We're going to remove more paint from the vehicle than would typically occur on an in-service vehicle, but our vehicle has been abandoned for some time in the desert heat and sun. This would wear the paint faster, as the daily average temperature during the summer in Arizona is 95 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 35 degrees Celsius. The line that our carriage operated on was the Tucson and Tombstone Express. This line later became known as the Arizona Mail and Stage Line after a brutal robbery occurred in 1881 where a stagecoach belonging to John D. Kinner was attacked by bandits, resulting in the death of the driver and a passenger. Now we're going to finish the coach details by painting the coach's upper railing with a golden brass color. The paint we used for this was Citadel Retributor Armor. This is a fantastic metallic paint that provides great one-coat coverage. Often it makes it easier to achieve a great finish from metallic paints when you apply them to a black base color. The black base color allows this paint to showcase the metallic shine that's inherent within the paint from the small amounts of glitter. Now let's get started on the base of the diorama. This is cut from a slab of insulation foam from my local home improvement store. I'm going to use an empty butter cookie tin to ensure that I can get a good circle shape. This is then cut to a general shape with a sharp hobby blade and the edges trimmed. I did most of the cutting and trimming off camera, as it is hard to get a good angle for the camera to film the action. Now we're going to use a sanding stick to smooth the edges of the foam base. Our goal is not to achieve a perfectly smooth finish, but something simply good enough, as we're going to finish it at a later point in the build. Now we're going to start the foam removal process to create the scenery of our diorama. This is going to be done by using a hobby blade to remove thin layers of the area I marked off camera for the trail. This is important to not remove too much foam here, as we're still going to be applying some reductive techniques to the base to get the texture we want in the end. The next step in the reductive process we're going to use is heat shaping the foam to create both a hardened surface and a series of smooth rolling shapes. I have a very important safety note for this step. Make sure that you wear a respirator and perform this step in a well-ventilated area, as the fire used releases rather nasty fumes that are very dangerous that you do not want to breathe in. Now we're going to seal the diorama base. This is done with a mix of matte Mod Podge and Vallejo tan earth colored paint. This both applies a basic paint color to the base as well as sealing the foam base from future weathering products that would otherwise dissolve the foam. Side note here, the finished color that this step leaves was not as opaque as I wanted, so we ended up later covering this up with a primer later. We're attempting to create a somewhat rocky desert terrain in this step. The location I've selected for this diorama is somewhere along a desert trail between Tucson and Tombstone, Arizona in the old American West. Now we're going to add some small gravel to the diorama base. This is done in two steps. The first step is adding the gravel directly to the previous Mod Podge mix, then applying this mixture to the edges of the road to create a rocky ridge along the edge of the trail. Then we will sprinkle some loose gravel onto the still wet surface. It'll stand off the surface a little bit more than the previous mixture. Now we're going to apply the base ground color to the now primered base. We're using Vallejo Tan Earth once again, this time thinned down by about 25% with water. This allows us to apply the paint as almost a wash, letting it flow around and into depressions and other objects on the surface. This will recreate the desert floor base tones we had to cover up with the primer from the previous step, while introducing the impression of shadows into the base. I've often seen this referred to as pre-shading. Washes are probably the most versatile weathering tool for beginning modelers. They allow you to create depth and shadows that really help bring the environment you're creating to life. There are several colors of washes available commercially depending on what color you're applying them to, and really can suit any need that you have. Now we're going to highlight the trail from the rest of the environment by applying a dry brush of Vallejo Dark Flesh. The best way to get a good dry brush is to load the brush with paint and then remove 99% of that paint on a clean paper towel. You want just enough paint on the brush to catch the edges of the surface without flooding the surface. This will highlight the raised edges and create the impression of dried dust that is collected on the trail surface from numerous passing coaches and horses. The next step in creating our desert environment is applying some homemade scrub brush. These were made by cutting bristles from an old worn paintbrush and gluing the ends together to create small bushes. These are then applied to the base with standard PVA glue. This will hold the brush in place and any excess will dry clear. By adding a small amount of plant matter, we help to both highlight the barren nature of the desert environment we're creating, as well as break up the uniform nature of the scene that we have created so far. Something I can recommend to any diorama maker is that you attempt to strike a balance between enough detail to catch the viewer's eye and keep the scene interesting, and adding so much that the scene becomes cluttered and hard for the viewer to focus on the areas that you want the project's primary focus to be. This is best determined through trial and error, to be entirely honest. Each diorama will have its own balance requirements, and what may be too many items for one diorama is just right for another. Never be afraid to try something new. Sometimes the results will surprise you. Let's go ahead and create the last bit of flair for the project. We're going to make a simple road sign from small sections of balsa wood. These are soft enough to cut with your standard side cutters and are easily shaped with most of your modeling tools. The two towns we're referencing in this diorama are Tucson and Tombstone, Arizona. This sign is then glued together with PVA glue and fixed in place to the diorama with PVA glue as well. I wanted to make sure to mention our partner in this collaboration, Terrain by Aaron. Aaron is a fantastic model builder and one of the most creative scratch builders on YouTube. I'll have a link to his channel down below. Make sure to follow the link in the description and give him some love. Now we're going to apply the sign to the base. We're creating the holes with a small round file about the size of the post we made the sign from. We'll use PVA glue to fix the sign to the base in a prominent location that helps grab the viewer's attention. That completes this project. I want to thank you for supporting the channel, and as always, just keep building. So let's get to the glamour shots.